So thank you. This is the last paper then in the panel on populism and people. In our paper, what we're going to talk about is populism versus the people, and we're going to look at social representations of home. So I'll introduce myself. My name's Kesi Mahendran. I'm based at the Open University. We've just established a new collaboration which is about public dialogue psychology. I'm working in that collaboration with two colleagues, that's Sue Nieland, who you can see here, and Anthony English, and we're all based at the Open University. So populism versus the people, how citizen social representations of home destabilize national populism's territorial vision. As I say, we're going to present the three of us together on this. I'll just set up the talk by talking about the way that we work and this particular study. Then I'll hand over to Sue, who's going to talk about populism and home. And then finally, Anthony will present the three main findings that we have about home, and that's threatened space, birthplace, and life course. And finally, I'll do some wrapping up. So let's start with Donald Trump. Still a story, I think, as it turns out, in January 2021. This is him telling four congresswomen, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, probably most famously, Ilhan Omar, Anya Presley, and Rashida Tlaib. He tells them the following: "I'm viciously telling the people of the United States, the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run. Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested place from which they came from? Then come back and show us," and it just goes on from there. And you can notice how he's framing it up with this idea that they should go back, i.e. that they are not currently at home, even though they are citizens of the US, and 3 out of 4 of them are born in the US. You could think it was something that was occurring in the American context. We have the same sorts of tropes occurring in the UK. This is Boris Johnson saying just ahead of the last election, EU migrants have been able to treat the UK as if it's the part of their own country for too long. I think that's the key bit, for too long notice. And this, what we're saying really is that though it's quite subtle, the concept of home is playing as a key component of populism, particularly this kind of ethno-national, nationalistic populism. And the key thing is that it's effectively unhoming certain sections of the citizenry. Bakhtin, the ethical philosopher, said that those kinds of centralizing, quite hegemonic frames are at the same time being decentralized. And what he says is that this process, this uninterrupted process of decentralization and disunification, results in a contradiction-ridden, tension-filled unity of two embattled tendencies. So these very tensions that we're raising in this talk are really a key to cracking this one. The central question driving the talk then, and indeed the articles, are: what is the relationship between populist leaders' implicit and explicit use of home and the people's own social representations of home? We're going to move fairly fast, so if you're interested, there are 2 new articles, both publishing this year by myself, Anthony, and Sue, and they are Populism versus the People, which is in the Journal of Theoretical Social Psychology, and then No Obvious Home, the dialogical creation of home during the 3rd wave of decolonization. And that you might have heard the kind of racialization that's occurring as a part of this, and we drill a little deeper into that in the Human Arenas paper. So the we then, as I say, is PDPC. It's a new collaboration that we've set up, and our aim really is to move from public opinion to public dialogue at a time of direct democracy where these sorts of things count. The public voice is getting stronger, and so it becomes more important to really facilitate opportunities for the public to engage in dialogue rather than express opinions. I'm not going to talk too much to this slide, other than to say that the website it will be available the early part of this year, and there's the link there to the site. And what we'll do in our work, or what we do across our work between the 3 of us, is look at the dialogue between citizens and their governments. So the paper that we're presenting today is based really principally on study 2. There's been, last 10 years this kind of work's gone on. We're not using study 3, the newer data, which was collected just before the pandemic, working mainly in Scotland, Sweden, England also, and then Germany and Ireland. How the public do democracy is really a way of bringing the public into dialogue with the big themes, the big policy statements of the day. And all three of us work in the same way in that regard. Anthony and Sue, in their own PhDs, do this work as well of bringing the public into dialogue with the policy developments and the events of the day. When I say the public, I'm referring to people across a migration mobility continuum. Okay, so it's a busy slide, but there's lots on this in the publications on the PDPC website. And the key point to note is that when you think of the public, you're quite often at risk of thinking of a static citizenry, but the public consists of people who are generationally non-migrant for possibly centuries even, but certainly for decades, all the way through to people who are moving, have moved several times, and when you ask them, fully intend to move again. So I'll pass now over to Sue Nieland.
Thanks, Kesi. Populism works through mobilization of the true people against the other to unhome the latter. There are two dimensions of populism. The horizontal dimension of the in-group and out-group works by putting forward only the true people who should consider themselves at home in their nation state. By doing so, it unhomes the out-group. The vertical dimension of populism is the elites versus the ordinary people. And in this dimension, the true people are not protected by the corrupt elite because they've allowed liberal levels of immigration to threaten their home and their nation state. From this, home for the true people is the stable, constant and secure location, but home for the othered is threatened, unstable and insecure. Populist leaders use their rhetoric to unhome. They threaten the sense of home in others, and we've seen this by the use of Theresa May's Citizens of Nowhere, and under her watch in the Foreign Office, the use of vehicles that were patrolling the streets telling immigrants to go home. As Kesi already mentioned, we have the example of Donald Trump, who again referred to the 4 Democrat Congresswomen of people who should go back to the countries they came from in 2019. And we've seen both Boris Johnson and Priti Patel threaten EU citizens as not being at home in the UK, part of the post-Brexit rhetoric. The undermining of home is a very easily seized rhetorical tool, and it's particularly salient at this time because home is much more of an important space. It is the safe, secure space, free from the virus. Populism also plays into something called the nationalist rhetorical triad. And this works to persuade us of a glorious past that is reconstructed, a threatened present and a bleak future. Reconstruction of the past makes the homeland seem threatened in the present, because in the past, the true people form the nation state. And the present is stalled. It requires action, because if we don't, the future is bleak. And those actions include things like reducing immigration, securing the borders, taking back control, sending immigrants home. Our research then looks at what the dialogical citizen is articulating as home. And we ask the question, what are those social representations of home that are held by citizens with different levels of migration and mobility? We actually looked at interviews where references to home were actually made both across generations, intergenerationally, and chronotopically through time. And I'm now going to hand over to Anthony to talk about the findings.
The first one is the idea of home as a threatened space. You see that participants with a higher level of migration mobility, particularly a sense of home by an internalization of populist threat, i.e. a level of personal security. The second one is home as a birthplace. Participants with a perceived migrant background reject the populist hegemonic representations of home, the idea of ancestral birthplace. And if you don't have an ancestral birthplace, you're not a legitimate citizen. Instead, they have this future-orientated projection of a final resting place. And thirdly, home as a life force. You see that participants with a low migration mobility, they have a higher security, and therefore see home as a transitional phases. For example, living with one's parents, living with an individual, living with a couple, and gradually home changes in those places. What I'd like to do now is talk about those three things more specifically with the key factors in each of the different findings, and also show some examples in the transcripts. A quick reminder, the migration mobility continuum. So we have the non-mobility, the generational of low or non-mobility. We have people of a low mobility who have perhaps moved once or twice and then settled. And then we have the high mobility, people who have moved many times and intend to move many times. So we have home as a threatened space. So we have two examples here. LH, who's single move settled from Canada to Germany, and KB, who's also single move settled from Sudan to England. And we see that they both have a country of birth. They're seen as an anchoring representation of home. So when we move to a new place, they anchor that and contextualize that by the country of birth. We have home as a future-oriented chronotype. So they say that people project their ambitions of what their new home is to be. It's a future orientation. We'll come to some examples in a moment. And also have these populist tropes about birthplace, that if you're not born in a particular place, you're not seen as perhaps a legitimate citizen. These claims by populists have an impact on their sense of citizenship. So for LH, I moved from Canada to Germany, he says, it would be good for me to think I have this official, to have a German ID, to have this, it's more of a practical thing. But I think it's also something in my head where I think, now I'm settled here. Now there's no danger. And we have KB. I've got my home in Sudan still, my father's home, parents' home in Sudan, but I don't know when I will be there. I'm bound with my family. My family is my husband and children. Where are they going to be? This is, in the future, I don't know. This idea of sort of future projections tied to the family, and home is a threatened space because of the populist tropes. So we have home as a birthplace. We see here that's JB, who's an MC2, lives in Glasgow, and JS, who's a very high mobility of 9, and moved from Finland to Sweden, as originally from a Roman background. And they both have the idea that their final resting place is indicative of where they consider home to be. So it's not only a literal sort of reclaiming of the soil from the blood and soil rhetoric of populists, but also a symbolic reclaiming that now they're seen as a legitimate citizen. And indeed, this is a way of foreclosing any ambiguities around citizenship, having buried there, having a family member buried there. So if we look at GB in Glasgow, they're talking about actually a friend's story, but taking it on to represent themselves here. And it says, his father died, we buried him in Scotland, and he suddenly, at that point, when he buried a member of his own family in Scotland, and he suddenly realized, oh my God, this, my father's now buried in the soil of this country. Up until that point, there was a possibility that we move back to birth country. This idea of birthplace being a final resting place. And here we have JS. He says, but Finland, I want to be buried there. I'm born there, my passport is very important, even if I'm not Finnish. So there, again, about going back and having the resting place as being a legitimate place of home. And finally, we have home as a life force. So participants with a low migration mobility, between 1 to 4, often have this higher sense of security to their home. And we see that for LB, there is NMC1 from Sweden, and KX, also NMC1 from Sweden. We both see home as being part of sort of an intergenerational perspective here. So we have a focus on people rather than places. So they have their parents, and then if their parents were to pass on, and they do, perhaps that place won't be home anymore. And this somewhat challenges the idea of blood and soil. It's pushing against the idea of place and focusing on people. So we have LB saying, but there is nothing about Gothenburg that has me feel like, wow, Gothenburg. Here, I want to stay, but it's more to do with practical reasons, like get a job here, or I know people, which is kind of a comfort factor. Let's focus on people. Then we have KX, and he says, okay, you don't think about these things, but when I think about when my parents isn't here anymore, I will lose the connection to home. It's maybe more about the connection to my parents. It's actually, again, of rejecting place and focusing on parents. So these three things together all have an aspect of populist content to them, and a rejection of populism on some level. Okay, and to finish off, we'll move on to Kesi to wrap up.
So thanks for that, Anthony, and thanks for that, Sue. I think that sets it up really nicely. And the take home then is that people actively make themselves at home. They use intergenerational and transnational dialogue, and we found that right across the migration and mobility continuum. The key findings in the first paper are that the social representations relate to threatened space, birthplace, and life course. I think undermining home, I think Sue made this point, is particularly pernicious at the moment when home has become this safe haven away from the virus, but yet it continues to be an easily seized upon rhetorical tool. So national populism succeeds by using a protectionist version of home, yet in citizens, irrespective of their degree of migration and mobility, as Anthony showed, the imagined movement and the very idea of imagined movement, imagining your own death, imagining your parents dying, and all these different ways that we engage in a sort of dialogical creation of home is a challenge to populist certainty of blood and soil. So thank you very much. And Anthony, Sue and myself look forward to discussing this with you at the conference next week.